friends, and welcome to episode 29 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own and do not reflect those of my district. When incorporating research, I always cite my sources. So whether you are a veteran or novice school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I would like to extend a special welcome this week to listener Karen in Virginia. Thanks to the Twitterverse, we found that we both have a couple things in common, including we're both elementary librarians and we're also parents of University of Michigan students. And there's something to be said for sharing that experience of sending your daughters away to school. My statistics revealed a very interesting and an almost immediate spike in listeners which occurred from two countries, Qatar and the UAE. And I'm absolutely fascinated. I would love to learn more about your programs, and I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and your episode suggestions, either on Facebook or Twitter, or the email address for this podcast, schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to thank you with a podcast sticker. And now for today's episode, Burnout and Self-Care. Before describing library burnout and self-care, this will come as no surprise to you, but it happens to be the very nature of our job that lends itself to burnout in the first place. I do plan to refer to several articles which were written by and intended for our public library counterparts. There is enough overlap in our job descriptions, our responsibilities, and our shared patrons that we would benefit from these articles. Margot Del Guidis wrote, in Avoiding School Librarian Burnout, Simple Steps to Ensure Your Personal Best for Library Media Connection in January-February's 2011 edition, Margot said, quote, "The desire to help others is so innately ingrained in all librarians that it sets our profession down a path towards mental burnout and poor health," end quote. She also wrote, quote, "As we strive to help patrons around us, many times we neglect our own needs. It is an occupational hazard, especially as librarians are now working harder than ever to prove their worth in a fog of budget cuts and economic uncertainty." End quote. This sentiment is echoed by Katie McLean in her article for BookRiot.com posted on February 2nd, 2018, titled, "I Am Not a Superhero, The Stress of Library Work." And in this article, she concludes that we librarians are being stretched too thin due to budget cuts, and we're being asked to do a great deal more. And once upon a time, our high school libraries had 3 full-time librarians. Now we have 1. Today, each elementary librarian in our district is in charge of the collections for 2 libraries and teaches in 4 to 6 different buildings every 4-day rotation. Another reason why school librarians are prone to burnout is because of the toll emotional labor takes on us every day. The term emotional labor was described by Catherine Bodnar in Chapter 19, Library Burnout, Recognizing the Causes and Dealing with the Effects. I'll attach a link in the show notes. Quote, "Emotional labor was first coined by Arlie Hochschild in 1983 and is defined as a type of labor which requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others." End quote. In other words, we must quash our own emotions in order to do our jobs effectively. We must function every day, all day, in our library, surrounded by hundreds of children, and never let on that we might be having health concerns or personal struggles or relationship struggles. The nature of our job means that we must stifle or suppress our own concerns and worries and issues so that we can be a full service to the needs of our patrons. And I have witnessed teachers and school librarians return to work after experiencing unimaginable personal loss, but you'd never know it by looking at the dynamic in their room. The students would never know, and the day progresses as usual. Catherine Bodnar goes on to explain the multitude of job responsibilities means librarians have to be many things to our many patrons. And unlike teachers who can meet in grade level or subject matter teams within their buildings, and oftentimes work in classrooms which are in close proximity to one another on the same hall or the same floor, I often joke that if there are 2 librarians in one library, one of us is lost. This means school librarians need to resort to a remote PLN. We seek the support of fellow librarians on Twitter and Facebook groups and other social media platforms. Lastly, Randy Dalton, writing in the To the Library blog on March 30th, 2018, posted the following: "Library burnout is real." I'll include a link in the show notes. Randy said something which particularly connected with me. Quote, "Some days it just feels like all I did was troubleshoot. 7 out of 10 times someone asks me something, there's a good chance I don't have the answer, but it's my job to pull the resources together for this person, and that can take a lot out of me." End quote. Let me begin by saying that I am no medical professional. I don't even play one on TV. I do have mom hands, and in the past 20 years, I have learned I can detect a fever with an impressive level of accuracy. My concern is that this episode might come across as negative, that I don't like my job or my profession. On the contrary, this podcast is a labor of love because I love my job, because I love my profession. But as you also might suspect, this podcast is a direct product of me experiencing burnout, winter of 2018 to be precise. But I suspect after listening to this particular episode that all of us in our listening community have experienced 1 or 2 of these symptoms at some point during our school year, regardless of where you are in your career. Perhaps while you listen to this podcast episode, you might smile, you might nod your head in agreement. My hope is that in sharing these issues out loud, you might both come away with a sense of shared struggle and healthy, productive ways to address these feelings. I know better than to go to WebMD to diagnose myself. I didn't use WebMD. I went to the Mayo Clinic. Quote, "Job burnout is a special type of work-related stress, a state of physical or emotional exhaustion that also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and loss of personal identity." A link is provided in the show notes. The post asserts that burnout is not a medical diagnosis, but can have many mental and physical repercussions. Ask yourself, and these are quoted from the article, have you become cynical or critical at work? Do you drag yourself to work and have trouble getting started? Have you become irritable or impatient with coworkers, customers, or clients? Do you lack energy to be consistently productive? Do you find it hard to concentrate? Do you lack satisfaction from your achievements? Do you feel disillusioned about your job? Are you using food, drugs, or alcohol to feel better or to simply not feel? Have your sleeping habits changed? Are you troubled by unexplained headaches, stomach or bowel problems, or other physical complaints? End quote. Let me just say, looking at these symptoms, I wasn't experiencing them all the time, and most of my days started out just fine. But increasingly, I was aware that I was experiencing some of these feelings at work, and it didn't take much to get there. I can personally speak to experiencing stress-induced heartburn when I learned that my job was going to change. Instead of being a librarian 5 days a week, I was going to be a librarian 3 days a week and the school technology teacher the other 3 days a week for a 6-day rotation. And that summer, I experienced some of the most terrifying physical experience of having this heartburn, but if I could describe it, it felt like somebody stepping on my throat all the time. And I hadn't eaten anything. And after my physician spent a long time talking to me, we established that the one thing that was changing was my job. And the nice thing to know is that as soon as I started work in the fall, I learned that not only did I like my new job, I found it to be a refreshing change and a break from what had become routine. I was a better librarian because I was also the technology teacher. My heartburn disappeared almost instantly, and I never experienced those symptoms again. I will share something that I have noticed with some of my teachers. I was walking down 4th grade hall, and we're talking about physical symptoms here. I was walking down the 4th grade hall, and in a very loud whisper, I hear, "Amy, get over here now. I have to go to the bathroom." And I found out that this particular teacher had been involuntarily transferred from the middle school to the 4th grade. And in the first 6 months of school, she had been diagnosed with 3 different UTIs. When I asked my own physician why this was the case, she said that mail carriers and teachers, the 2 most likely professions to suffer from UTIs, because we have absolutely no control over our schedule. I will continue with the Mayo Clinic, and it goes on to describe the possible causes of job burnout. And number 1 is the lack of control. Again, as I just hinted, the fact that our schedule is completely out of our control is a problem. The first time that I became aware that I had 0 control over my job assignment came rather late in my career. Around lunchtime, exactly 5 years ago, I was instructed that I was going to be meeting the superintendent at the end of the day. That afternoon was a blur, and I was pretty sure I was getting RIF'd. If you're not familiar with the term, RIF is a reduction in workforce, or to be let go because my job no longer existed due to cutbacks. I learned that that was only partially correct. It is never good when you walk into the room of your superintendent and there is a box of Kleenex on the table in the meeting room. My dream job was being eliminated. But good news, quote, "I was part of the district's vision," end quote. Those exact words were said to me, and I don't know how I remembered it with such clarity between my tears and my sniffling, but I was being involuntarily transferred to the middle school, and the program I had so tenderly developed and devoted the last 7 years of my life was going to disappear. I spent the next month in a zombie-like state. I grieved while I finished the school year. The entire staff was sympathetic, and there is something to be said for being missed before you actually leave your job. It's almost like attending your own funeral. Anyway, we all deserve to be celebrated like I was. It's just really unfortunate that you have to have your job terminated in order for that to happen. Anyway, this year we learned that our district will be closing several elementary schools and moving our 5th graders up to the middle school. The news has left the entire staff, at best, very distracted, at worst, very distraught. What should be an exciting time of the year, as summer vacation approaches, has now been replaced by something of a rather somber mood in many of the schools which are on that list for closure. And no doubt you know school librarians who experience layoffs. You might even have similar stories of your own. What I did learn when I was researching my episode last fall titled "We Are Lifelong Learners," that we are by nature very resilient, and when facing adversity, when the doors close, we always find new and various opportunities ahead. The second item listed by the Mayo Clinic is that our job expectations are unclear. And I will say, in my particular circumstance, this doesn't apply to me. My job expectations are delineated very clearly because I have an assistant. The specifics of our job are spelled out because all too often we're not working together in the same library. Number 3 is dysfunctional workplace dynamics, which can contribute to burnout in your job. And many of the examples they used were being micromanaged or being, as we say, thrown under the bus by a colleague. I will add another complication is that cliques form, and somehow there is this rather exclusive club that teachers can have. Specialist teachers who cover multiple buildings don't always have the same opportunities to build relationships with each staff. And since the librarians in our district are always scattered, coming together once a month for department meetings is really our only support, other than the texts that we exchange and our emails throughout the day. The fourth contributor to work related burnout is the extremes in activity, and that is vacillating between, say, monotony and chaos. The words I used to describe my first few years as a librarian were words such as shell-shocked, bombarded, and phrases such as catch my breath, or keeping my head above water, or coming up for air. I described this in my episode about There's a Substitute in the Library, and that I never took a day off for years because I barely felt I could function while I was at work, let alone have the time to contemplate the chore of writing sub-lesson plans just so I could take a day off for some necessary self-care. Another contributing factor is the lack of social support. This can be both at work and at home. I didn't marry a teacher. It's a good thing I didn't. And I have the utmost respect for those of you who have, and even more for those of you who are working in the same district or same building as your partner. I learned very early in my marriage that my husband has zero interest in hearing me talk shop after a long day at work. I had to find a sympathetic ear, somebody who wouldn't require a great deal of backstory even when I needed to vent. Hopefully, there's somebody like this in your life to whom you can freely and honestly express yourself. For me, it's my sister. She's a fellow teacher in the district, and I've been very fortunate to be able to call her and talk to her whenever I need to. And I know I serve oftentimes the same function for her as well. I've also been very fortunate to work in a district with library clerks, and they've been an incredible source of support, especially because when we have students and book checkout, we're all in the room together. They don't have the same teaching responsibilities I do, and oftentimes my clerks observe things that I'll miss. They're an extra set of hands, they're an extra set of eyes, and an extra set of ears, which helps me time and time again. Another contributing factor to our burnout is our work-life imbalance. And I'm pretty sure that the youngest and newest school librarians can relate to this. When I was 22, I graduated from the University of Michigan. My college boyfriend was going off to law school in the fall, and I needed a job. And the market for teachers in the United States was lousy, so I looked for an opportunity to teach overseas. I entertained some options to teach in Kuwait and Medellin, Colombia, but I decided to accept a position teaching U.S. history on Guam at Simon Sanchez High School. With no family, no boyfriend, or even friends on the island when I arrived, I really had no reason not to just devote all of my available school time to building up my non-existent resume. During my 2-year stint, I co-sponsored student government. I chaperoned every dance, including the junior and senior prom. I sponsored the mock trial team. I was one of the assistant coaches for the track team. I attended island cleanups, student hikes through the boonies, and a multitude of fiestas, patron saint festivals, and my students, who were all sophomores, their quinceañeras, which more resembled wedding receptions than birthdays for 15-year-olds. My morning prep was spent selling snacks to raise money for our teams, and my evenings were spent taking students to competition. I was half a world away and more than happy to add to the growing list of my extracurricular activities to bolster my credentials. Now is a good time to mention a terrific interview which Jennifer Gonzalez gave on her podcast, The Cult of Pedagogy, episode 119, posted on April 14th, 2019. I'll attach a link in the show notes for both the audio file as well as the transcripts. In this episode, Jennifer interviews Angela Watson, a national board-certified teacher turned instructional coach. She has a terrific website with lots of resources, thecornerstoneforteachers.com. She's the author of 4 books, most recently, Fewer Things Better. She has also a weekly podcast called Truth for Teachers, and she's the creator of the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Club. And so it was a really fascinating conversation. They discussed the 3 school norms which cause teacher burnout, and I'm guilty of all of these. And whether you teach in a high school or a middle school or an elementary library, I'm sure that you've heard one or more of the following echoed in a weekly staff meeting, an update, and an email, either stated outright or it was implied when you were sitting listening to your administrator. Think of all the times your administration was looking for volunteers to attend an evening activity or to sponsor a program or club on the school's behalf. The first one is "We are a family." And I heard this a great deal in the 2 years that I worked in a Catholic high school. The principal would begin with an explanation about our precarious financial situation, our enrollment projections, and our efforts to keep tuition manageable for all of our families. And we, speaking to the staff, are part of this family. What are we, the staff members, going to do to help our school family? The second school norm, which oftentimes contributes to burnout, is let's do it for the kids no matter what. And this plays on the fact that, first of all, many of us are women, and a large number of us are also parents. There isn't anything we wouldn't do for our own children. So by making our students our kids, it stands to reason that while we may not be enthusiastic about extending ourselves for our district or administration, we would do anything for our kids. The third and final school norm, which can cause burnout, is this idea of being a team player. You don't want to look like a slacker. You don't want your building to think you aren't contributing or supporting their efforts. And I learned this very clever portmanteau. I can't take credit for coming up with it, but this term was a combination of the verb to volunteer and to be told, to be voluntold. I learned about this word years ago while I was in the staff lunchroom in one of my buildings. I was venting because despite the fact that I had completed all of my evening obligations, I was being wrangled to supervise the spring vocal concert. And this includes monitoring students who are off stage while other grades are performing. I was resentful. I had made sure I wouldn't need to commit to any spring activities months ago. I had a senior who was graduating that month, and I had children of my own who played instruments. May is a busy month for all of us because they have end-of-the-year concerts. With my evaluation weighing heavily on my mind, I found myself with all sorts of school commitments I had been voluntold to do. For these reasons and more, we find ourselves agreeing to do more and more work while neglecting our own needs. So, how do you recharge? What do you do to keep yourself from getting bogged down at work? What forms of self-care help you? Some of these suggestions are immediate fixes. Some of them are meant to be long-term and sustain you. Some of these suggestions are rather general and common sense. For example, many articles cited getting adequate sleep, eating healthy, and doing some sort of exercise every week. And while eating healthy may be the same advice I give my daughter when she's working extended hours in her nursing clinicals, it does need to be said that we must be deliberate in planning our lunches. All too often, we get really busy, and our eating habits fall back on the random food that can be found in the staff lounge. Bagels or breakfast Danish, a pan of brownies to celebrate a staff member's birthday, boxes of unfinished Girl Scout cookies, bags of extra Halloween candy, trays of cookies brought in by grateful parents during the holidays. All of these are empty carbs, full of nothing but calories. There's no protein in sight to keep our hunger from returning very quickly. I finally started packing hard-boiled eggs and kept protein bars in my office in a screw-top metal canister. I want to make sure everybody learns from my mistake. There was one year I left granola bars in my filing cabinet in June. Mice can't get into a locked filing cabinet, right? Wrong. I walked into my building mid-August to be greeted by my custodian. He wanted to assure me that the mice were no longer in my office, but indeed they had found the food left in my filing cabinet. With trepidation, I unlocked my office door, and I was met with a stench I will not soon forget. In 2.5 months, generations of mice had feasted on assorted boxes of snacks. They had clawed open the boxes, made nests of the cardboard. They had littered every surface with urine and feces, and I would spend days with rags and a bottle of Lysol disinfecting my office. When it comes to exercise and self-care, I am aware of coworkers who run together each morning. 4 to 6 of them will meet in front of the high school track, which I pass when I'm walking my dogs at 6 a.m. One of my buildings has a weekly staff yoga session, which is led by a 3rd grade teacher who is a certified instructor. A couple coworkers would eat lunch together during their prep and walked throughout the local neighborhood during their actual lunch. For a while, I would run the Detroit Marathon and the Half Marathon. I shared this with a couple of my coworkers who were also training, and it was important that we support one another in our races, and we all agreed to wear our race shirts on Monday. I did want to spend some time describing some of the suggestions made in Margot Delguidis, her article about avoiding burnout. First of all, attend conferences and workshops. This is my absolute favorite. I love having these on my calendar to look forward to. Whether I'm presenting or attending, this brain break is important and a time that I can recharge. We all need to let somebody else be the teacher from time to time, especially because during teacher training and school and district PD, it's not unusual that I might be leading some of the training sessions. This winter, because we missed 5 days due to the polar vortex and ice storms, I was more than happy to spend 2 of my Saturdays in February attending ed camps. I encourage you to look into ed camps in your neighborhood districts. These are typically free, and they're unconferences, which oftentimes qualify for continuing educational credits, which you can apply towards recertification. This is a good time to mention that I have just found out I am attending ETSI conference in Philadelphia this June and Nerd Camp in Parma, Michigan in July. If any of you would like to meet up, please reach out and let me know. I would love to meet in real life. Along those same lines, might I also suggest you schedule an instructional round? I spoke about this earlier. In my district, all teachers are allocated 1 day each year to shadow another teacher. In my case, I always choose to visit a library outside of my district. During my instructional event round, I would show up and shadow the librarian all day. I'd walk around like a tourist, taking photos and absorbing everything. This type of observational learning leaves me with a host of photos, a notebook full of new teaching strategies and new lessons to try, new displays to try and create, new routines to implement, and new titles to purchase. I'm invigorated with the possibility of new things that I can try on the very next day I go back to school. If your school district doesn't have a comparable program, reach out, find a librarian in a neighboring district who's amenable to this, and then approach your administrator with a request. The second recommendation that Margot made is to learn how to say no. And this isn't easy. I certainly couldn't say no to my administrator who voluntold me to supervise evening activities and after-school events. But just because you receive an email looking for staff members to supervise this or that event doesn't mean that you're always the best choice. We do tend to have the easiest time because, by and large, we work with every student in the building. However, being the staff representative at this PTO function or that concert or Thursday night's ice cream social or Saturday's carnival doesn't always have to be you. Once you've completed your contractual obligations, become more selfish with your off hours. I made the decision years ago to give up my lunch for years in exchange for student volunteers who would work with me in the library. Because I didn't have a clerk or an assistant, it seemed like a fair trade. I described using student assistants in my November 4th episode. Take a listen if you'd like. The third advice that Margot gave us is to learn to let go. Be absent when you need to be. All too often, we work through illnesses because there's just too much at stake leaving the library in the hands of the sub. I spoke about this challenge in my March 11th episode. There's a substitute in the library. What could possibly go wrong? Parentheses, everything. But just as important as it is to stay at home when you're sick, it is also important to take that occasional mental health day. I am aware of many of my coworkers who save a personal day for the week leading up to the holidays to knock out shopping and errands. My father, who was not a teacher, but he knew when he needed a day for himself, would tell us, that he had the GBWs and he would not be going to work today. The GBW stood for General Body Weakness. The fourth suggestion, which Margot gives us in her article, is to ask for help when you need it. Making use of student and parent volunteers, while it might require some initial training on your part, will alleviate some of the more mundane tasks, especially when it comes to preparing for book fairs. Obviously, there are privacy issues in protecting student information when you access the computer programs, but if parents or students can check books in or assist with dusting and straightening the shelves, perhaps processing discards, it does go a long way in freeing you up. The fifth suggestion Margaret gave in her article was to beat the budget blues, and this is by collaborating with your public library for resources. And I depend on my public library to supplement a great deal because we use interlibrary loan. My budget can go a lot further when I can borrow the things I need from the public library for my student research. The sixth suggestion, which Margot gives us, is to reach out when you feel burned out and it's become insurmountable. Your employers should have resources to assist employees in getting the counseling they need, and this should be confidential. If you're concerned at all about confidentiality, you should contact your union representative so that they can make sure you get the support you need. In order to add to this list, I would like to add Hilda K. Weisberg's post titled Positive Self-Care on her blog on libraries, dated October 28, 2018. I'll attach a link in the show notes. Hilda reminds us that we need to maintain our social supports and to make sure that you differentiate between your work supports and your family supports. And as I mentioned before, I rely on my sister because she is a safe and confidential sounding board whenever I need to vent about work, and I didn't marry somebody who is interested in hearing about my problems at school. He's a nice guy, though. I do know some teachers who utilize book clubs every month. I've heard of a couple staff members who also study scripture together. And one of my buildings is using mindfulness with their students, and that practice is finding its way into the teachers' daily routines. Another great piece of advice is to find hobbies and to recognize that over the years, your interests and your hobbies will change and evolve. Sometimes your hobbies are going to be on the back burner to raise small, needy children of your own. But as the mom of adult children, which is, by the way, one of the most amusing oxymorons, I can assure you that there will come a time in the not-too-distant future when you will need to rediscover your hobbies. In Library Burnout is Real, Randy Dalton offered, quote, "We all have our favorite forms of self-care. Indulge yourself in yours," end quote. For example, quote, "Find an exciting new outlet. Instead of completely turning your brain off, engage in something else exciting and see where it goes," end quote. Journaling, offered up by Hilda, is one suggestion which was described in great detail by Bill Sanwald on December 16, 2018 in ALA's blog titled Self-Care for Librarians. I'll attach a link in the show notes. This is a terrific article if you like journaling. It is very much tailored to a librarian audience. Bill wrote, quote, "Beyond being fulfilling and fun, journaling is a critical way for me to engage in self-care, and I would argue it is the key technique to supporting my well-being," end quote. Bill then described many of the benefits to journaling. Number 1, a method to keep a record of my life. Number 2, a tool to organize time. Number 3, a way to hold on to memories. Number 4, a prompt for self-reflection. Number 5, an outlet for creativity. Along the same lines as journaling is creating a blog, an online journal of sorts. Catherine Bodnar speaks to why there are a multitude of librarian blogs. Quote, "Sharing personal narratives about burnout serves numerous useful functions. It is helpful and cathartic to commiserate through shared stories. It can also lead to productive problem solving, but perhaps most importantly, sharing burnout narratives has also the effect of reclaiming one's sense of humanity. End quote. I did find an interesting blog with submissions from 3 creators identified only by their first names, Kat, Jess, and Allison, called The 5-Minute Librarian, and a post from April 2016 titled, What You Can Do to Combat Librarian Burnout. There's a link in the show notes. The advice which caught my eye, which was get some instant relief, and suggestions such as fidget toys, Play-Doh, or, and I have something similar, perhaps you do too, it's called a damn it doll, and you can thwack it again and again, and it does help. There are other suggestions for immediate relief, which included watching funny YouTube videos, webcams of zoo animals, and engaging in some good old-fashioned retail therapy. Buy something frivolous and fun for yourself. My friend, who was an elementary art teacher, kept a knitting project, a simple knit pearl scarf close by. I knew if I saw her knitting after her round of classes that day that she probably needed some time out. Last, some staff members get together on payday or first Friday of the month for a drink, and some school librarians create podcast episodes as their form of self-care. Whichever self-care you choose for yourself, recognize that we work in a very demanding field, and if you ever feel burned out, you are not alone. I want to thank you for listening today. Please consider sharing this episode with your PLN and other school librarians in your preferred social media platforms. This podcast is intended to support school librarians all over the world as we collectively work to raise critical thinkers, responsible users of technology, and lifelong readers each and every day. Just a reminder, when you email the podcast at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com, please include a mailing address, and I'll be sure to send you a thank you sticker. The topic for our next episode, whose title has yet to be chosen, will address the implications of shutting down our libraries at the end of the school year. I hope you will tune in.